Here's a shocking reality. America's busiest commuter railroad almost ground to a complete halt this week, potentially stranding 250,000 daily passengers. But here's where it gets controversial. The union workers just pulled what some are calling a brilliant strategic move that has officials crying foul. The Long Island Railroad, which holds the distinction of being the United States' most heavily trafficked commuter rail network, just dodged a massive bullet that could have created transportation chaos across the New York metropolitan area. Workers represented by various labor unions made headlines Monday when they announced an overwhelming vote authorizing their leadership to initiate a work stoppage if contract negotiations continue to stall. But here's the part most people miss. These same union representatives simultaneously made a calculated request to President Donald Trump, asking him to establish what's known as a presidential emergency board. This tactical maneuver effectively pushes any potential strike timeline from this Thursday all the way to January, giving both sides several additional months to hammer out their differences. Let's put this situation into perspective for anyone unfamiliar with the scale we're talking about. The LIRR serves as a critical transportation lifeline for approximately 250,000 commuters who depend on it daily to travel between New York City and the sprawling eastern suburbs of Long Island. A complete service shutdown wouldn't just inconvenience these riders. It would create an absolute transportation nightmare that could ripple through the entire regional economy. And this is where timing becomes absolutely crucial. The potential work stoppage threatened to coincide with one of golf's most prestigious international events, the Ryder Cup tournament. This 3-day competition between American and European golfers is scheduled to begin September 26 at Bethpage State Park in Farmingdale, Long Island, with organizers expecting roughly 225,000 spectators to attend. Imagine the logistical disaster if hundreds of thousands of golf fans suddenly couldn't reach the venue via their primary transportation method. Gil Lang, who serves as the general chairman for the union representing LIRR locomotive engineers, addressed the media Monday from the union's Manhattan headquarters. His words carried a tone of cautious diplomacy. This action does not mean a strike won't happen, but it does mean it won't happen now. He emphasized the union's commitment to responsible negotiation, stating, "We will continue to be the adults in the room. A strike is the last thing we want. And we'll do everything we can to avoid that." But here's where it gets controversial. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which oversees the LIRR along with other regional transit systems, isn't buying the union's diplomatic rhetoric. MTA officials fired back with harsh criticism, dismissing the union's announcement as nothing more than a cynical delay that serves no one. MTA spokesperson John J. McCarthy didn't mince words in his statement. If these unions wanted to put riders first, they would either settle or agree to binding arbitration. And if they don't want to strike, they should say so, and finally show up to the negotiating table. This raises a fascinating question about negotiation tactics in labor disputes. Is the union's request for presidential intervention a legitimate strategy to prevent service disruption? Or is it simply a way to gain leverage while keeping the strike threat hanging over everyone's heads? The political dimensions of this dispute add another layer of complexity. Both the MTA and New York Governor Kathy Hochul had previously resisted calls to establish an emergency board, despite having the authority to request one. Instead, the MTA announced contingency plans last week, including free shuttle bus services that would transport stranded commuters from LIRR stations to subway connections in Queens. Governor Hochul, a Democrat, has been playing her own strategic game, pointing fingers at the Trump administration for the ongoing dispute, while simultaneously urging both parties to return to the bargaining table. This political maneuvering raises another controversial point. Should state officials be using federal administration criticism as a negotiation tactic in what's essentially a local transportation labor dispute? To understand the rarity of what almost occurred, consider this historical context. LIRR workers haven't gone on strike in more than 3 decades. The last work stoppage happened in 1994 and lasted approximately 2 days. There was another close call in 2014, but then Governor Andrew Cuomo managed to broker a last-minute agreement that prevented any service interruption. At the heart of this entire controversy lies a fundamental disagreement about compensation. The 5 labor unions representing roughly half of the railroad's workforce are demanding a 16% wage increase spread across 4 years. Meanwhile, the MTA has countered with an offer of 9.5% over 3 years. That's a significant gap that goes beyond just percentages. It represents different philosophies about worker compensation, cost of living adjustments, and the financial realities facing public transportation systems. Here's what makes this situation particularly intriguing. Both sides are essentially asking the public to take their word about who's being reasonable and who's being stubborn. The unions claim they're being responsible by seeking presidential intervention to avoid disruption. The MTA argues that the unions are playing games and should either settle or accept binding arbitration. So here's the million-dollar question that deserves your input. When public transportation workers threaten to strike, affecting hundreds of thousands of daily commuters, should unions be required to accept binding arbitration rather than potentially disrupting essential services? Or do workers have the fundamental right to withhold their labor, even when it impacts critical infrastructure that entire communities depend on? What's your take on this delicate balance between workers' rights and public necessity? Do you think the union made a smart strategic move by asking for presidential intervention? Or does this seem like a way to keep the threat of disruption hanging over commuters' heads while gaining negotiating leverage? Share your thoughts. This is exactly the kind of labor relations issue where reasonable people can have completely different perspectives.